Rick Salinas, a single father who raised his daughter Adrienne and her younger brother on his own, finds himself in a state of panic on Father's Day. Despite the close bond he shares with his 19-year-old daughter, who is now living independently with friends, Rick has been unable to reach Adrienne for 2 consecutive days. Concerned by her lack of response, especially on such a significant day, Rick decides to contact one of Adrienne's roommates, Shani, hoping to locate his daughter's whereabouts. To Rick's dismay, Shani reveals that Adrienne has not been at the apartment since the early hours of Saturday morning, when she left during a party they were hosting. However, Shani provides a glimmer of hope, mentioning that Adrienne likely went to her boyfriend Fran's place, as she often does when she's away for a day or two. Shani even confirms that she witnessed Adrienne and Fran leaving the apartment together that night. Finding solace in this information, Rick takes a moment to collect himself. He is familiar with Fran, a young man who has been a part of Adrienne's life since they were both in the 8th grade, and considers him to be a decent person. Rick hangs up with Shani feeling slightly reassured and proceeds to call Fran to verify his daughter's safety and whereabouts. Unfortunately, Rick's hopes are shattered when Fran reveals that Adrienne is not with him either. Fran too has been attempting to contact her without success. Confirming Shani's account, Fran explains that he and Adrienne did indeed leave the party together around 2:40 in the morning, due to an argument that arose from Adrienne's jealousy over Fran's interactions with other girls at the party. The couple decided to leave the chaotic atmosphere of Adrienne's apartment and retreat to Fran's place to discuss the matter more calmly. However, Fran discloses that their time at his place was brief, lasting only a few minutes before Adrienne expressed her desire to return to her own apartment in the ongoing party. Fran drove her back to Tempe, but according to his account, he did not complete the journey to her doorstep. Strangely, Fran claims that Adrienne abruptly exited the vehicle a few blocks away from her residence, insisting that she would walk the remaining distance. According to Fran, the last time he saw Adrienne was when she exited his vehicle a few blocks away from her residence, insisting on walking the remaining distance home. The circumstances surrounding her departure from the car are unclear, but it appears to have been an escalation of their earlier argument, with Adrienne possibly making a dramatic gesture to test Fran's reaction or emphasize her desire to be away from him. Despite the unusual nature of her exit, Fran took steps to ensure Adrienne's safety. He contacted Adrienne's other roommate, Rebecca, informing her of the situation and requesting that she notify him once Adrienne arrived home safely. Fran's actions demonstrate a level of concern for Adrienne's well-being, even though he could have simply followed her home. Upon learning this information, Rick immediately drives to Adrienne's place to investigate further. There he encounters Rebecca, who confirms Fran's account, stating that Adrienne did indeed return home around 3:30 in the morning. However, Rebecca reveals an additional detail. Adrienne's stay at the apartment was brief. She charged her phone, gathered an overnight bag, and announced her intention to return to Fran's place before departing in her own car. This new information raises concerns about Adrienne's state of mind and her ability to drive safely, given the late hour and the likelihood that she may have been under the influence of alcohol or emotionally distressed following the party and the argument with Fran. The decision to drive herself back to Fran's place rather than having him pick her up adds to the perplexing nature of the situation. While the back and forth between Adrienne and Fran's residences and the various modes of transportation involved may seem confusing, it is plausible that Adrienne's actions were driven by her heightened emotional state and a desire to convey her frustration to Fran. At 19 years old, it is not uncommon for individuals to make impulsive or less than responsible decisions, especially when dealing with relationship issues. As the story unfolds, it remains unclear whether Rick harbors any suspicions towards Fran at this point, given the complexity of the situation and the limited information available. Despite the complex nature of the situation, Rick does not harbor any suspicions towards Fran, as he believes Fran would never harm Adrienne. Having known Fran since middle school, Rick trusts him. However, unable to locate his daughter on his own, Rick decides to contact the Tempe Police Department to report Adrienne missing. The police agree to meet Rick at Adrienne's apartment to take the report. But upon their arrival, the situation becomes even more perplexing. Rebecca recounts the same information she shared with Rick earlier. Adrienne returned home around 3:30 a.m. on Saturday, only to leave again in her car, presumably to return to Fran's place. When they investigate further, they discover that Adrienne's car is indeed missing, but her car key is found in her room. Everyone involved insists that Adrienne only has one car key. The question arises as to whether the roommates are being dishonest or if they are just as bewildered as everyone else. It appears that they are genuinely confused, as lying would have been counterproductive. If they wanted to deceive, they could have easily claimed Adrienne had a spare key or that she never returned home at all. Moreover, additional evidence found in Adrienne's apartment further complicates the notion that she had packed up to go to France for a few days. Her purse, containing essential items such as her ID and bank cards, is found in the apartment, along with clothes on the floor that her roommates identify as the same outfit she was wearing on Friday night. Rebecca maintains that when she saw Adrienne leave, she was still wearing the same clothes. The possibility of Adrienne returning to the apartment again after leaving to retrieve forgotten items like her purse and keys, and then changing clothes before departing for a third time is considered. However, this theory fails to explain why she would have left her purse and keys behind once more. The missing piece to this perplexing puzzle may lie in a 911 call received later that same day. Around 3:45 a.m. on Saturday, a woman reported a car driving erratically, speeding past her on a tight curve and ultimately crashing into the median, resulting in 2 fully blown-out tires. The caller, who was not Adrienne, stopped to check on the driver, concerned that they might be injured. This 911 call could potentially hold the key to finding Adrienne and unraveling the mystery surrounding her disappearance. Before the 911 caller could reach the crashed vehicle to check on the driver, the car sped off. The description and license plate number provided by the witness matched those of Adrienne's vehicle. This raises the question of the car's current whereabouts, as it was no longer at the crash site when police arrived on Saturday morning. The proximity of the accident to Adrienne's apartment and Fran's residence is unclear, but it is believed to have occurred within a few minutes' drive in Tempe. Fran lives in Scottsdale, which could be approximately a 15-minute drive away. While it is not definitively known if Adrienne was driving her car at the time of the accident, the timeline suggests this is a reasonable assumption. Adrienne left with Fran at 2:40 a.m. Rebecca saw her return around 3:30 a.m. and then leave again, and the 911 call was received at 3:44 a.m., less than 15 minutes after her departure with an overnight bag. On Sunday evening, investigators issue a bolo be on the lookout for Adrienne's car. The sources provide conflicting information about the exact timing of the car's discovery, with some indicating that Rick and Fran find it on Sunday evening, while others state that investigators locate it on Monday morning. Regardless, the car is found only a few blocks from Adrienne's apartment and is examined by investigators by Monday morning. The prevailing theory is that Adrienne drove the red car towards her neighborhood, abandoned it a few blocks away for unknown reasons, and then walked home. This could explain why her key, purse, and clothes were found at the apartment. However, the roommates did not see her return or leave for a third time after this point. The possibility that Adrienne returned to the apartment unnoticed by her roommates is considered, as the events took place in the early morning hours when they might not have been around or awake to witness her coming and going. Additionally, the party atmosphere and alcohol consumption could have impacted their memories or perceptions. The discovery of the car raises hopes for progress in the investigation, but the narrator's tone suggests that this development may not provide the clarity or answers hoped for. Investigators photograph Adrienne's car upon discovery but do not impound it or process it for evidence. Instead, they release the vehicle to the family, according to reporting by William Pitts on 12 News. This decision raises questions about the thoroughness of their examination and the potential missed opportunities to gather crucial evidence. Before handing the car over to the family, investigators note the presence of a notebook and a BlackBerry, likely belonging to Adrienne, on the driver's seat. However, they do not review the contents of these items, merely documenting their presence. The lack of apparent signs of foul play seems to be the justification for not retaining the vehicle for further investigation. Despite the release of the car, investigators are not entirely inactive. On the same day, they obtain exigent records for Adrienne's phone from the night she went missing. Exigent records, a term previously unfamiliar to the narrator, are a limited set of phone records that investigators can access quickly without a warrant in certain circumstances. These records provide information about the calls Adrienne made and received that night, as well as the timestamps of text messages she received, although the content of the texts is not included. The narrator questions the logic of not examining the contents of the BlackBerry found in Adrienne's car, as it could potentially provide context for the text messages and aid in the search for the missing person. The need for a warrant to access the full contents of her phone records is acknowledged, but the narrator wonders if the family's permission could have been obtained, given Adrienne's age and ownership of the phone. Despite these limitations, the exigent records yield important information. Investigators noticed that Adrienne made over 40 calls to Fran in the early morning hours of her disappearance. This revelation prompts the narrator to question why investigators have not yet interviewed Fran, a seemingly crucial step in the investigation. The fact that Fran has not been interviewed at this point in the investigation is met with surprise and disbelief by the narrator, highlighting the apparent inconsistencies and puzzling decisions made by law enforcement in their handling of Adrienne's case. The narrator expresses disbelief that investigators have not yet interviewed Fran, Adrienne's boyfriend, considering it a fundamental step in a missing person case. The oversight is compared to the decision to return the BlackBerry found in Adrienne's car without examining its contents. Despite this initial misstep, investigators do locate Fran on Monday, finding him in a park hanging up missing person flyers for Adrienne. When asked to come in for questioning, Fran agrees without hesitation and is forthcoming with information. He appears to be devastated by the situation. Fran recounts the same story he told others, detailing the fight between him and Adrienne, their departure together, the drive back to her place, and her abruptly exiting the vehicle. He maintains that he did not see her after that and went home to sleep. Upon waking up on Saturday, Fran discovered numerous missed calls from Adrienne and, more significantly, a text message from her at 4:43 a.m. stating that she was coming over again. The timestamp of the text message raises questions, as it contradicts the timeline of Adrienne's car accident around 3:45 a.m. Fran allows investigators to view the message, confirming its authenticity and the 4:43 a.m. timestamp. The narrator ponders what Adrienne could have been doing for the hour between the accident and the text message, considering the distance between Fran's place and the lack of readily available transportation options like Uber in Tempe in 2013. The narrator reiterates the potential significance of the BlackBerry in shedding light on these discrepancies. However, the situation surrounding the BlackBerry worsens when a detective realizes the following day that the car was not properly processed before being released. Investigators attempt to retrieve the vehicle, only to discover that the notebook and BlackBerry are missing. Adrienne's mother confirms she has the notebook, but the whereabouts of the BlackBerry remain unknown. The disappearance of the BlackBerry is particularly puzzling, as investigators had photographic evidence of its presence in the car. The narrator questions who could have had access to the vehicle and removed the device. Talking to the boyfriend, however good of a kid he is like missing girl 101. That's probably taught the same day they cover not giving back the BlackBerry. I know, but it's not to say that they don't, right? Like again, they're still trying to figure out what's going on. They know Dad talked to him. They actually do track him down on Monday. So, within quick succession. And when they track him down, he's like in a park hanging up missing persons flyers for Adrienne. And when they ask him to come with him for questioning, he agrees, zero hesitation, and he is really upfront with them. He's also devastated, early seems to be, and he says the same thing that he told others about them fighting, them leaving together, driving back to her place together, her hopping out. He didn't see her after that. He says that he just went home and went to bed. And then he woke up Saturday to just autonomous calls from her, and maybe more significantly, he also woke up to a text from her. This was from 4:43 in the morning, and that text said that she was coming over again. 443. But if she's in that accident around 345, that doesn't add up. I know, and we know it was 443. Like he showed them the message. They can see what her calls and texts stopped. Like, yeah, they confirm this is true. Yeah, Fran lets them see whatever they want. He is telling the truth. There is a text from exactly 443 from her saying she's coming over. Okay, then what has she been doing for an hour? We know Fran's place isn't within walking distance, but what year is this? Like childhood internet, the BlackBerry era gives me some frame of reference, but it was 2013 and this happened. Okay, yeah, 2013. So we're in the BlackBerry era, but did the greater Uber period even begin by then? If so, what was it even like in Tempe? Like even now, at that time of day, it's super tough to get an Uber. Yeah, I know. I can remember being in Chicago around this time and getting an Uber and it being like very new to me. So I don't know if it was like super prevalent. I don't know if it was being used a lot in Tempe. If she requested one, if that's a thing, like as far as I can tell, there's no record of anything like that. Okay, I feel like a broken record at this point, but you know what could really help them figure this out? Dude, I know the BlackBerry. But Fran, this whole BlackBerry situation gets even worse though, because when a detective realizes the next day that the car hasn't been processed, they're like, oh, okay, we actually got to get that back. So I'm wondering if it got released accidentally because they seem all of a sudden like, oh man, we probably needed that. Like, just kidding. Yeah. So they go to get it. This is Tuesday now, just a day after releasing it. So it's actually not too long. It's not like we're missing weeks of time. The problem is when they go to get it, the notebook and the BlackBerry are just straight up gone. Well, yeah, that's what happens when you don't secure evidence from day one. But I mean, the car was released to her family, so they would have to stop, right? Just go get it from them. Well, Adrienne, the mom, says she has the notebook, but no one has the BlackBerry, and they're 100% sure it was there. I mean, they took pictures of it. Well, then who the fuck took it out? I don't know, because as weird as this sounds, I don't know who all had access to the car. Investigators seemingly did not do much to figure out certain aspects of the case. As a result, they never ended up finding some key evidence. Ashley notes that all of this could have been prevented. The situation looks bad, and there's no way to avoid that fact. However, to the speaker, this doesn't seem like an innocent mistake. It appears intentional. Questions arise about who had access. The speaker admits to feeling they're missing something critically important because the situation with the BlackBerry is confusing. The phone was present at one point. Photographs were taken of it and released. But then the phone disappeared. Much of what happened that night and the contents of the phone seem important. It appears as though someone might have taken it, and the question of who could have done so is raised. The disappearance of the phone seems very significant, but apparently only to the speakers discussing the case. Despite the BlackBerry being gone, there is still hope. Investigators might still be able to work with the records they have. Almost all the outgoing calls were to someone named Fran, except for one. This particular call might turn out to be the most crucial of all. According to 2015 reporting from NBC News, this call was made slightly after 4:20 a.m. on Saturday morning. This is approximately 25 minutes before she sends a text to Fran saying that she's coming back. The call she made was to a local cab company, which the speaker likens to Uber of the olden days. Investigators naturally want to speak with this cab company as soon as possible to determine if they took a fare, who the driver was, and where the passenger went. Upon contacting the company, they discover it's a family-run business owned by Thomas Simon Sr. and his son Thomas Simon Jr., who is one of the drivers. For clarity, the speaker notes that when referring to Tom from this point on, they mean Thomas Simon Jr., the son. If they need to mention the father, they'll specify Sr. or use another clarifying term. Tom confirms that he was the one who had been in contact with Adrienne, presumably the missing person that morning. The investigators decide to interview him in an unusual manner. They set up a call with both Tom and his father, Tom Sr., on the line. Tom Sr. is in his office, but Tom Jr. is driving passengers to the Grand Canyon during the interview. The speaker expresses disbelief at this situation, questioning when this page of the investigator's manual is taught. They speculate that perhaps the investigators were trying to make the interview happen as quickly as possible, which is somewhat understandable, but they feel that a lot of control is lost in a situation like this. The speaker then asks the listener to imagine being a passenger in the back seat, overhearing one end of a conversation while being driven not just to dinner, but to the Grand Canyon, a remote area in the middle of nowhere, while the driver is being interviewed about a missing girl. The speaker emphasizes the unsettling nature of this scenario, where the person being interviewed about a missing person is in control of the vehicle. The speaker reflects on the unusual situation of being a passenger in a cab while the driver is being questioned about a missing person. They note that on one hand, it might seem exciting to be inserted into an active investigation. However, the reality of being in a cab heading to the Grand Canyon while the driver is being questioned about a person who disappeared from his cab is unsettling. The speaker admits that while they'd like to think they'd remain calm and take notes in such a situation, they believe they would panic in reality. They express a desire to stop the car and get out, but acknowledge the futility of such an action given the remote location. The speaker reiterates their disbelief about the conference call method of interviewing, expressing confusion about why investigators chose this approach. According to an episode of the unresolved docuseries from local media outlet Arizona's Family, Tom, the cab driver, confirms that he spoke with Adrienne, the missing person, that morning. He agreed to meet her at an AM/PM convenience store a few blocks from her apartment. Tom warned Adrienne that he wasn't nearby, explaining he was finishing another fare and would arrive in about half an hour. Adrienne reportedly said she was fine with waiting. Tom states that as he neared the meeting point, he called to reconfirm the ride. During this call, Adrienne said she wasn't at the location yet but would start walking there. The speaker assumes Adrienne was likely walking from her apartment, based on the known timeline of her movements that night. However, when Tom arrived at the parking lot minutes later, Adrienne wasn't there. He parked, waited, and tried calling her multiple times without success. Tom claims he eventually got out of his cab, walked around, and had a smoke. After waiting about 10 minutes, he assumed he had been stood up and left. He finished his night as usual, driving to his father's house to drop off the lease money before going home to sleep. When questioned about whether Adrienne's phone records match Tom's story, it's confirmed that they do. The records show the initial call from Adrienne to Tom, as well as the incoming calls from Tom that he mentioned. The speaker expresses surprise at this corroboration, having expected discrepancies. Regarding surveillance footage, it's noted that the AMPM, being a convenience store, has security cameras with comprehensive coverage of the parking lot. Investigators obtained this footage, which further backs up Tom's story. The cameras show Tom pulling in, waiting in his car, getting out to walk around and smoke, then getting back in the cab and driving away. Throughout this time, Adrienne is not visible in the footage. The speaker notes that while this lead initially seemed promising, it appears to be fizzling out as quickly as it arose. However, they then suggest that perhaps this isn't the end of this lead after all. The narrative takes an unexpected turn as the previously fizzling lead unfizzles significantly. Within days, investigators receive an interesting tip related to Tom's conference call interview. One of the passengers in Tom's cab during the questioning was extremely disturbed by the entire situation. Surprisingly, it wasn't just the conversation that unsettled them, but Tom's behavior after he hung up the phone. According to an episode of People magazine Investigates, the passenger reported that Tom's overall demeanor was suspicious and highly stressed. While this could be understandable given the circumstances, what happened next was particularly bizarre. Before reaching their destination, Tom pulled over to the side of the road and began rummaging through his trunk. The speaker notes that if they were the passengers, they would have wanted to leave immediately. However, given the remote location of the Grand Canyon, with long stretches of uninhabited areas, there was nowhere for the passengers to go. The most alarming part of the incident follows. As Tom searched through his trunk, the passenger claims he pulled out what appeared to be a hacksaw. Tom then reportedly mumbled to himself, saying something like, "Hey, how did that get in there?" The speaker expresses shock at this revelation, questioning how Tom could not know he was driving around with a hacksaw in his cab. They also wonder why Tom would let passengers who overheard his conversation about a missing person know about the hacksaw. Interestingly, the passengers reported to investigators that they got the impression Tom was genuinely flustered upon finding the hacksaw. They didn't feel he was trying to threaten them, but rather seemed genuinely surprised by its presence. The speaker, however, questions why Tom went to his trunk in the first place. Given the strange nature of these events, according to reporting by William Pitts for 12 News, investigators put Tom under surveillance within a few days. Shortly after, they asked him to take a polygraph test, which he declined, stating he doesn't trust such tests. The speaker wonders if Tom has prior experience with the criminal justice system or a criminal record. It's revealed that as far as can be determined, Tom doesn't have a record himself, though his father does. This could have influenced Tom's decision to decline the polygraph test, either through previous interactions with law enforcement or knowledge of the unreliability of polygraphs. It's also mentioned that Tom has a lawyer who advises him not to cooperate further with the investigation. The speaker suggests that perhaps it was the lawyer who advised Tom not to take the polygraph test. The conversation begins with a discussion about Tom already having a lawyer, which one speaker finds telling. The other speaker acknowledges that while most people don't immediately have an attorney, they're unsure of the exact timeline of events. They suggest that getting a lawyer isn't necessarily suspicious, as it's following established legal advice. The speakers agree that having legal representation is probably good advice for someone who claims to be surprised by finding a hacksaw in their own vehicle. However, investigators aren't willing to let Tom potentially dispose of evidence, so they quickly return with search warrants for his apartment, cab, and DNA. The reason for the DNA warrant isn't entirely clear, but it's suggested it could be to compare with potential evidence in Adrienne's car, or in case physical evidence is found on Adrienne herself if she's discovered later. Tom is brought to the police station for a buccal swab, which also gives investigators an opportunity to observe him and potentially get him to talk. The interview is described as extremely bizarre. Tom is initially handcuffed, shirtless, and shoeless in the interrogation room, playing hacky sack with a red Solo cup while waiting. His demeanor throughout the interview is described as strange, likened to a child feeling picked on by a teenager, angry and embarrassed as if his feelings are hurt. After the buccal swab is taken, Tom becomes hostile, yelling at the investigators. According to the unresolved docuseries episode titled Faces in a Crowd, he uses profane language and expresses hatred towards them. It's confirmed that Tom is not under arrest, only in custody for the DNA sample collection. Once the sample is obtained, he must be released. Regarding the searches of Tom's apartment and cab, no incriminating evidence is found, nor any signs of cleanup. His living spaces are described as messy, with his cab being slightly less so, but still not clean. Notably, nothing is found that ties Tom to Adrienne or her disappearance, including the previously mentioned hacksaw. The speakers find the disappearance of the hacksaw suspicious. They speculate that if Tom had a hacksaw around the time of Adrienne's disappearance, it would be concerning but potentially explainable. However, the fact that the hacksaw is now gone, possibly disposed of before the search, is seen as more problematic. The speakers express confusion about how Tom could have gotten rid of the hacksaw while under police surveillance. They describe it as a riddle without a clear answer regarding the whereabouts of the surprise hacksaw. The narrative continues with uncertainty about whether Tom still possesses the hacksaw or has disposed of it later. The police surveillance on Tom is not maintained for long. Despite collecting DNA and releasing Tom, he soon reappears on the investigators' radar. Approximately 2 weeks after the DNA sample incident, Tempe Police Department receives another tip about Tom. The tip comes from a woman who calls to report that her cousin, an employee at Tom's apartment complex, heard a woman screaming from inside Tom's apartment while doing maintenance work outside. The cousin believed someone was trying to muffle the screams, possibly by covering the woman's mouth. When the cousin turned down his music to listen more closely, the volume of music inside Tom's apartment was increased significantly. Notably, this tip was not made as an immediate 911 call, but rather as a later report to a tip line. It appears the woman's cousin mentioned the incident to her casually at a later time, and she felt compelled to report it. The exact timing of the screaming incident is unclear, but it occurred sometime after Adrienne's disappearance. Upon receiving this information, investigators promptly go to Tom's apartment. However, Tom refuses to let them in, indicating that the relationship between Tom and the investigators has deteriorated. When they attempt to follow up with the woman who made the tip, hoping to get more information or potentially obtain a warrant, they are unable to reach her. In fact, they never manage to contact her again. The narrator makes a direct appeal to the tipster, if she's listening, stating that the police would like to speak with her again as she might be the only person who could advance the investigation. Due to the inability to reach the tipster, this lead, like the hacksaw tip, leads nowhere. The narrator wonders about the identity of the screaming woman and what happened to her, considering the possibility that it could have been Adrienne, though this raises questions about her current whereabouts if she was alive for some time after her initial disappearance. With this lead stalling, the investigation enters a period of limited progress. Massive searches for Adrienne are conducted, with the FBI becoming involved in the investigation. Adrienne's family and friends work tirelessly to maintain attention on her disappearance, organizing fundraisers for reward money, and going door to door to ask if anyone had seen her. Investigators interview everyone from the party, but there are no signs of Adrienne. On July 21st, just over a month after Adrienne's disappearance, Tempe experiences a massive rainstorm, described as the worst of the summer. This storm causes significant flash flooding in the foothills of the nearby Superstition Mountains, which drain into an area called Weeks Wash. According to an episode of the unresolved docuseries titled A Secret in the Desert, the flooding in Weeks Wash is severe enough to uproot trees, move cars, and unearth a buried body. The narrator concludes by confirming that a buried body is indeed unearthed by this flood. On August 6th, investigators in Tempe receive a call from the Apache Junction Police Department, which has jurisdiction over much of Weeks Wash. They inform Tempe police that a local property owner has discovered the remains of a female. When asked about the distance between Weeks Wash and Adrienne's residence in Tempe, it's estimated to be about 40 minutes away. This implies that if the remains belonged to Adrienne, she did not end up there by accident or of her own volition. There are no obvious signs of the cause of death due to the advanced state of decomposition of the remains, which were likely exposed to the elements and flooding for an extended period. The remains are incomplete, notably lacking a skull. This could be due to decomposition or animal activity, and doesn't necessarily indicate the use of a hacksaw or intentional dismemberment. An autopsy is performed on August 9th, and by August 15th, DNA analysis confirms that the remains belong to Adrienne. Due to the decomposed state of the remains, the forensic pathologist is unable to determine a cause of death and classifies the manner of death as undetermined. There is some confusion about when investigators officially classify the case as a homicide. They initially state it is on August 15th, but then clarify on August 16th that it's yet to be determined. Regardless of the official classification, the case is being treated with the resources and attention of a homicide investigation. Extensive searches are conducted, with over 100 people searching a 4-mile stretch of Weeks Wash. These searches are challenging, with at least one instance of the search being temporarily halted due to excessive heat and encounters with numerous rattlesnakes, as reported by Catherine Holland. Despite these efforts, the searches do not yield additional information about Adrienne's disappearance or death. The exact duration she had been in Weeks Wash, or how long she had been deceased, cannot be determined with certainty. However, the forensic pathologist finds that the condition of her remains is consistent with the amount of time she had been missing. The possibility that Adrienne might have been alive for some time after her initial disappearance is discussed, though it's clear she wasn't alive for the entire duration. This leads to recollection of the reported screams from Tom's apartment. It's mentioned that investigators obtained Tom's phone records from around the time of Adrienne's disappearance, though the exact timing of this action in relation to other events is unclear. Here is a full retelling of the story in English, strictly adhering to the original chronology, meaning and plot in a documentary style without abbreviations. Investigators obtained Tom's phone records from around the time of Adrienne's disappearance. While they already have information about his interactions with Adrienne from her records, they hope to uncover more details from his records, such as any unusual activity or calls to other individuals. One detail immediately stands out to the investigators. On the morning of Adrienne's disappearance, around the time Tom claims he went home and went to sleep, his phone is turned off and remains off for a solid 12 hours. While this might not be unusual for some people, investigators find that it's not part of Tom's routine when they examine his phone records history. This appears to be a one-time occurrence. Despite the suspicion surrounding Tom and this peculiar phone activity, investigators make no further progress in determining what happened to Adrienne. On June 15, 2014, Adrienne's family marks the anniversary of her disappearance with a vigil, still lacking answers. Less than a year later, in February 2015, investigators receive another tip. This time, it's not about Tom. The tip comes from a man named King, who suggests that investigators should look into his former friend, an alleged serial killer named Brian Patrick Miller, also known as the Zombie Hunter. A month prior to King's tip, Miller had been charged with several gruesome murders of young women in Phoenix, dating back to the early 1990s. These women had been abducted while alone in the evening. Initially, King was outraged at Miller's arrest. They had met due to their shared interest in steampunk, a subgenre of science fiction set in a Victorian-era inspired world with futuristic technology. King had believed that while Miller was strange, he couldn't be a serial killer. However, King's perspective changed when he heard Adrienne's name mentioned among onlookers at Miller's house following his arrest. Adrienne's case reminded King of his sister, prompting him to investigate Miller's social media presence. Initially aiming to prove his friend's innocence, King became increasingly convinced that Miller might be connected to Adrienne's death. The connection King makes is complex. The homicides Miller was charged with involved women who were abducted while alone in the evening, their bodies found soon after, horrifically mutilated. One victim was decapitated, which King finds notable given that Adrienne's remains were found without a head, though the cause of this is uncertain. Through his social media investigation, King discovers that Miller had been in Tempe the weekend Adrienne disappeared, approximately a mile from her residence. King is further shocked to find a post by Miller about going for an early morning bike ride on June 15th, the day Adrienne disappeared. This would have placed Miller in Adrienne's neighborhood around the time she was walking alone towards the AM/PM. Additionally, King knew that Miller was very familiar with Weeks Wash and the Superstition Mountains, as he used to work at a Renaissance fair in that area every year. In addition to the previously mentioned connections, King notes that Brian was known to be bitter about women and often vented about it. Brian drove around in an old police car splattered with fake blood and called himself the Zombie Hunter. King believes these factors, combined with the previous coincidences, might be significant. The narrator comments on the recent trend of serial killers giving themselves nicknames, noting it's not a positive development. They mention a previous case involving a killer called Hannibal, and cite an FBI official discouraging the media from using such nicknames, as it can motivate potential criminals seeking fame. The narrator also suggests that these nicknames can fuel public hysteria. Authorities believe Brian was responsible for at least one other death besides the known victims from the 1990s. A girl who disappeared near his house in 1992 is thought to be another victim. which Brian essentially admitted to according to his ex-wife. Given the brutality of his known crimes, investigators suspect he had more victims, leading to his classification as a serial killer. As reported in People magazine Investigates, investigators in Adrienne's case take King's tips seriously. They interview King and serve a search warrant on Brian's house, looking for evidence connecting him to Adrienne. However, they are unable to find anything linking him to her death. The narrator speculates that evidence might not have been detectable due to the long-time gap between Adrienne's disappearance and the investigation into Brian. However, there are other factors that cause investigators to doubt Brian's involvement. For instance, there is no evidence that Adrienne was attacked with a knife, which was Brian's weapon of choice in his known crimes. Even in skeletal remains, investigators would expect to see some markings from a knife, which were not present in Adrienne's case. Furthermore, investigators examined Brian's phone records and found that his phone didn't ping anywhere near Weeks Wash in the days following Adrienne's disappearance. As of the time of narration, Adrienne's death and disappearance remain unsolved. Investigators don't have any official suspects, though they haven't ruled anyone out as a person of interest. This includes Fran, Tom, and Brian, although the narrator notes that Fran doesn't seem to be as seriously considered as Tom and Brian. As recently as July 2022, investigators were still actively working on the case and following up on new leads.